Welcome to the 39th episode of the series Decolonizing the Mind. I will do a sub-series of about 4 episodes on economic theory. And today I will discuss some basic concepts. And then in the episodes after that, I'll look into uh, the economic of China, India, Russia, and some other countries. So before I go into decolonial economic theory, obviously the past week we had the Iranian response to the Israeli bombing of Iranian consulate in Syria, which is a major historical event. And I want to discuss that before I go into economic theory. Uh, I use a few sources apart from the written documentation and the media information. The analysis, which I find very interesting, of Iranian professor of the University of Tehran, Mohammad Marandi. I love to hear his analysis always. Uh, the weapon inspector of the US, former weapon inspector, Scott Ritter, Colonel McGregor, specialist in military affairs, who is in the Trump camp, and Colonel Schackbaut, who works for the NATO, is a Swiss military officers. And they have interesting analysis which I draw from. Now, let's look at what happened in the past 2 weeks. On April 1, 2024, Israeli airplane struck the Iranian consulate embassy in Damascus, Syria, killing 16 people, including a senior Quds Force commander, Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Sahedi, and several other commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And 2 weeks later, Iran attacked Israel for the first time in history, attacked the state of Israel with 300 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. The sinus view of it is that the attack was a failure. It shot down 99% of the drones and the missiles. The Iranian view is that it was very successful because they hit military installations at the air bases from which the planes took off for the bombing of Syria. And these installations were at Nafatim and Ramon air bases in the Negev desert. And they struck an intelligence center in the occupied Golan Heights. The bombs were there and the images are there. Now, if we look at the sinus reaction, they have a contradictory reaction. First, they say, oh, it doesn't mean anything, we shut down 99%. And then they say, oh no, this is very significant because this is the first massive attack on the state of Israel and we should retaliate on this attack, meaning we should respond to it. And it's a big deal. Now, if you look at the military analysts and Mohamed Marandi's analysis, then there are a few things which we can draw from all these analyses. First of all, it was not just an Iranian attack. There were bombs from Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Palestine, and Iran. It was an exercise in synchronization of the whole axis of resistance. It's often overlooked, but one of the military analysts makes this point. It's very interesting to see, and saying that the US Army had a policy of leaving West Asia to focus on Europe to confront Russia and focus on Asia to confront China. Now they are forced to make a big investment to return in West Asia. So the policy is in ruins. The other thing is that the cost of the Iranian offensive was a few $1 million. A drone cost a few $100,000. sorry, for 10 or $20,000. But the cost of the Israeli defense and the American defense, because American, French, and British uh, forces were involved in the defense of Israel, was 1 to 2 billion dollars, and this is not sustainable if you have a longer, larger fight coming up. The other thing is, which a military analyst points out, the drones that um, Iran sent had intelligence, surveillance, and registrations apparatus within the drones. So it's not really bombs. They were sent there to trigger the defense system so that they could do the registration of how the defense infrastructure works, the communication works, send the data to Iran before they were shot. And they were expected to be shot because the Iranians gave the Israeli and the Americans notice of the coming attack so they could prepare for it. And the preparation then was registered and they collected all the data of the defense infrastructure and the communication infrastructure. The core element of the attack, the two airfields and the intelligence infrastructure, they did that and Israel could do nothing against it. And now what happened is that this basically put out a new equation in the military structure in Western Asia. The days that the US and Israeli strategy was based on deterrence, meaning that they could do whatever they want because people and the governments were afraid, and especially Iran was afraid to retaliate against their attacks. Those days are over. The deterrence now comes from Iran because directly attacking the state of Israel with the risk of a wider war is now on the table, and Iran says, I'm ready for you. I'm ready for Israel. I'm ready for the US. So bring it on. So the deterrence is over, and a new deterrence comes into place that Iran says now, if you strike us again, we will come back and hit you very hard. The other interesting thing, one military analyst observed that Iran used Chinese Beidou satellite navigation and Russian GLONASS system satellite navigation to prepare for the attack. So obviously there was military backing in terms of intelligence by Russia and China, which fits in the broader picture of the Russia alliance with Iran and China. Um, and that's interesting to know. The US has 55 military bases around Iran, and now all these bases has become targets now. Even the ships, the aircraft carriers that the United States sent to the Mediterranean, two aircraft carriers, are now targets. So if they attack Iran, these ships will be bombed to the bottom of the sea. The military bases in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the neighboring countries will be bombed, and their oil and gas installation will be bombed. And the days are now over that you could threaten Iran. When Biden said to Iran, don't attack Israel, and he says don't, with the emphasis that if you do it, something horrible will happen, it didn't work. And the other thing is that the first time that Iran struck the state of Israel and the occupied territories of Palestine, where the state is established, emboldens the Arab Street and emboldens some Arab regimes who are doubting whether they should stay in the American camp. So the strike of Iran against Israel has enormous political, military, and even intellectual consequences because the colonization of the mind is over. Now, Israel said they did a response. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iran say, you sent just some toys and call that a response. That's a chicken response. But for now, the fear of escalation is over, and we'll see how it goes in the coming days and weeks and the coming period ahead. The genocide is continuing in Gaza, and the Israelis are now preparing for an invasion of Rafah, as Hamas and the resistance in Gaza are preparing for them also. The interesting thing is that Mohammed Marandi said in one of these interviews that in Gaza they are still continue building tunnels as we speak. So the capability of building tunnels, producing arms and rockets which they could fire on Israel, the recruitment of new soldiers by Hamas and the resistance is going on. So there is no sign of any defeat of Hamas, which was the objective of Israel and the West. Okay, so let's go back to decolonial economic theory. This is a vast subject. There's many things you can say about it. The chapter that deals with economic theory in my book offers a critique of Eurocentric economic theories. It presents alternative based on contributions from other civilizations, and obviously we need to translate it in practical tools for developing economic policies. Now, if we look at the Eurocentric economic theories, both in liberalism and Marxism, they have this concept of economic laws. The social evolution, social economic evolution of a society is based on laws. Like you have in nature natural laws, in society you have social laws. Now this proposition is disputed by knowledge production from outside the West, who dispute the notion that there are social laws, which, regardless of human intervention, is you should abide to those laws. That is how it works. For example, the law of the free markets, of the laws of the capitalist economies, and these are social laws. And then, depending on the school, you draw economic policies from those laws. So in liberalism, the free market and private ownership of the means of production are the best way to organize an economy, because the laws of the free market ensures the best way to get economic growth, welfare, and prosperity. That is the liberal view. The Marxist view is that there are laws in capitalism, there are periodic crises, and these crises, one of these crises, the bigger it comes, the greater the chance that it will lead to revolutions. And basically a socialist revolution that established a socialist society based on collective ownership of means of production and a planned economy. Now, the critique, a decolonial critique of liberal economics is that economic theory is not a science, it's just about ethics. So, a standard liberal textbooks by Samuelson and Nordhaus defines economics as the study of how society uses scarce resources to produce valuable goods and services and distribute them among different individuals. If we think about these definitions, we find two key ideas that run through all of economics: that goods are scarce and that society must use its resources efficiently. But in DTM, we could have another definition, that economics is the study of the production, financing, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, and the objective and subjective factors that drive them. And the objective factors could be things like natural environment and technology, but subjective factors are things like culture and ethics. So ethics is the basis of economics in a DTM theory of economics. And if we look at liberal economics, you see how they remove ethics An example is a book on the history of economic theories by Faji and Groenewegen. And this is one of the typical citations you find in many books. The discovery of the New World of America and the establishment of colonies there by some European states in the 15th century resulted in a large flow of gold and silver into Europe from Mexico and Peru. So what happens now? You see that the way they were discussing in the book the theory of mercantilism, so theory in the early phases of economic theory in Europe. And the thing we call theft, exploitation, or pressure is removed in formulations like a large flow of gold and silver, as if it is something that comes without any stealing, any oppression, any killing. It's just a flow that is neutral. That's why I say economic theory, liberal economic theory, is a theory that colonizes the mind. Many examples of it. It's not science, it's ideology. Now, if we go to Marxist economic theory, Friedrich Engels says the two great discoveries of Marxism is the materialistic conception of history, meaning that history is driven by material forces, and the revelation of the secret of capitalist production to surplus value. He said that these discoveries, socialism became a science. Now, here's my critique of Marxism, that the concept of surplus value is not a scientific concept, it's an ethical concept, meaning that it's not objective, it's how you think and what your view, ethical view is of value, what value is and what constitutes values. Besides economic theory in the West and the European Enlightenment, we have economic theories from other civilizations, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Islam, and sometimes we have to deduce the theory from the practice. How was an economy organized and structured and led, and then derived? But in many other cases, they are just theories, where the theory has developed. For example, Islamic economic theory, so very highly developed theories on finance, on production, on distribution. There are theories there which all take into account the question of ethics, based on ethics. And one of the things in the discussion of economic theory is what is the source of value. And Marxism says only labor, living and dead labor, and especially living labor, creates value. You know, what we do, we produce a book, we produce a computer, we produce a chair. So labor is produces value. But there are other theories that says no, there's not one source of value. Absolutely, labor is one source, but earth, land, water, air. An apple could grow just in a tree without any labor. It's there, and you could pick it and eat it up. Entrepreneurship. There are people with creativity and managerial capabilities. Steve Jobs invents the iPhone, and they create value. There's an argument for it. And then the question is, what is the role of the state? In the European Enlightenment, in liberalism, and I take one of the liberal economists, Ludwig von Mises, he says, as a liberal sees it, the task of the state consists solely and exclusively of guaranteeing the protection of life, health, liberty, and the private property against violent attacks. Everything that goes beyond this is an evil. So the role of the state is minimal. In Marxism, the state is the driving force in the economy through central planning and state ownership of the means of production. In other theories, the state is often sees as a driving force for economic development. And so the state has a role, although there are markets and although there's private ownership of means of production. I'll come back to that later on in later episodes. And now in DTM, I would argue that the state plays a leading role in the economy and uses markets and private entrepreneurs as a means to increase production and prosperity for the benefit of the masses of the people. So there's no contradiction for a revolutionary government to allow entrepreneurs, capitalists to flourish and do their work. But in a capitalist society, the state is based on the interests of the capitalists. But in a society based on justice, the state is to make sure that you increase production and increase welfare so that people can have a better life. And if capitalists can play a role in it, you should support it. Now, how the state functions depends on the practical circumstances of a country. And that's why when I discuss countries, the economic development of China, India, Russia, and other countries, I will show that. Now, I will give you some view of how the world economy is now structured and how to look at it. And basically, we should look at labor, demography, land and natural resources, technology, entrepreneurial tradition, functioning of markets. You know, I could go in general things, but I'll do it per country. But in general terms, to understand the world economy, I will start with countries with the proposition that countries with a huge population will play a major role in the future if these countries are free. So now we talk about the United States, India, and China, but mind you, because of the population, other countries will be very important, notably Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Brazil. Look at the figures. In 1960, India had a population of about 450 million. 60 years later, it grew to 1.4 billion, which is a growth of 280%, 18%. China in 1960 had 670 million, grew to 1.4, a slower growth rate than India, 112%. The United States, with 180 million people, has now a population of 330 million, 84% of growth. So the gap between 1.4 billion of India and China and the next biggest country in demographic terms is the United States with 300 million, that's big. You know, that is 1.1 billion is the difference between India, China, and the next country. So if we look at countries with more than 200 million people, Indonesia have 280, 276, Pakistan 240, Nigeria 220, Brazil 215. India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Brazil are countries, because of their huge demographics, will play a big role in the future if these countries are able to develop in themselves as free countries. Now, I'm interested in discussing BRICS and some progressive countries in Latin America, Latin Abiyala. The BRICS country, India, China, South Africa, Brazil, and the Russian Federation, and Iran now. And then you have Venezuela, where the Bolivarian Revolution is going on, in Cuba, and then always compared also with the United States. And then you see, obviously, I mentioned that apart from India and China, Brazil with 250 million people is a big factor. The Russian Federation has has 144 million, um, quite less than India and China. South Africa 60 million, Iran 89, almost 90 million, Venezuela 28, Bolivia 12, Cuba 11, and United States, as I said, 330 million. So demographically, uh, uh, India, China, Brazil, Russia are important BRICS countries, but politically, a country like Iran with 90 million people, politically they are very important now. So the second factor, if you talk about economics and economic development of a country, population is very important. We just took the number in terms of total population, but obviously you have the age structure which you have to take into account. Some countries have younger population, others more older population, the gender deficient, the birth, the death rate. All these things are important, but just to give you an impression that we should look at demography because they produce the wealth, the people produce the wealth. And then an important resource is land area. And here's the thing, if you look at which countries in terms of square kilometers are the largest country in the world, then it would be Russia. Russia has 16 million square kilometers, followed by China. China has 9.4, Russian Federation 16.4, almost half. The United States is as big as China, and then you have Canada with 8, Brazil with 8, Australia with 7. India is 1/3 of China in land area. And then you have countries like Argentina and Kazakhstan, who are huge countries, less populated than the others. So if you look into the BRICS countries, India has 3 million square kilometers, China 9, South Africa 1.2, Brazil 8, Russian Federation 16, Iran 1, Venezuela almost 1, Bolivia more than 1, Cuba is 100,000, United States 9. So because of the land, in the BRICS configuration, India, China, South Africa, Brazil, Iran, they have sizable land areas, which tells you something about their economic potential. Now, when we discuss economics of countries and compare them in the world, there are a few variables which you should get acquainted with. One is the gross domestic product. That is the value of all the final goods and services that has been produced in a specific period by a country. So what a country has produced, that tells you how strong the economy of a country is. That's a gross domestic product. And the gross domestic product per capita is when you divide the total value by the total population. And then there's another thing you should know. The gross domestic product is the value of all the goods and services in a certain currency. Let's say in Russia it would be the ruble, and then you can compare the ruble by exchange rate with the dollar. But that doesn't give you a good comparison. So they invented this term called purchasing power parity. And what it does, it takes a basket of goods and then it looks at this basket of goods, how much does it cost in uh, India, in China, in the United States, and that determines the ratio that you will use in calculation, which can differ from the exchange rate on the market of the dollar, for example. So GDP PPP is a good measurement a more correct measurement of the value that a country has produced and how strong a country is. And then they don't use the exchange rate of the dollar, but something called the international dollar, which is a hypothetical unit of currency that has the same purchasing power parity that the US dollars had in the United States at a given point in time. Meaning that that basket of goods, you look at what did it cost in the United States at a certain point in time, and that you take as a reference point to compare the others. And then another thing which is important is the Gini coefficient or the Gini index or ratio, which is a measurement of inequality. So how is income distributed? If one person owns everything, then you have perfect inequality, and that is 1, then the Gini coefficient is 1. If everything is equally divided, then then is perfect equality, and the Gini coefficient is then 0. So I'll focus on the GDP PPP in international dollars. And if you look at the figures, all my data are based on the World Bank database. Then the biggest economy of the world in 2022 is China. They have an economy, GDP PPP, of $30 trillion. You have a million, you have a billion, and you have a trillion. So a trillion is 1,000 billion, and a billion is 1,000 million. Now, United States have 25 trillion in 2022. In 1990, 30 years ago, United States was 6 trillion and China 1 trillion. So China has grown immensely in the past 30 years with 2,623%, while the US economy has grown with 327%. So China has surpassed the United States as the biggest economic power, as the biggest economy in terms of GDP PPP. So 30 trillion international dollar, that's how big China is in its economy. United States 25, India 12 million, you know. So India is almost a third of the size of the economy of China. Japan, which was seen, as the biggest economic tiger of the East, Japan is 6 trillion, 1/5 of China. Germany, 5.5 trillion. Russian Federation, 5.5 trillion. Indonesia, 4 trillion. Indonesia is a big upcoming economy in the world. Now, if you look at the BRICS, then you'll see, that South Africa is less than a trillion. Brazil is 3 trillion. The Russian Federation is 5 trillion. Iran, 1.6, almost 2 trillion. Bolivia, 100 billion. And the United States, 25 billion. So in the BRICS, the leading economy is China, followed, 1/3 later of its size, India, and then Russia, Brazil, China, Iran, sorry. So I mentioned this fact that Indonesia has an economy of 4 trillion. Italy has an economy of 3 trillion, Canada of 2 trillion, France and United States of 4 trillion, 3.9, 3.8. These are economies which are smaller than the Indonesian economy, yet they are part of the G7, the 7 of the world's advanced economies. United States, Japan, Germany, France, United Kingdom, Italy, and Canada. This is a joke. The G7 used to be an economic powerhouse. It's not there anymore. If Indonesia is bigger than Italy, what is Italy doing in G7? So you see how the world economy is changing, and the G7 has become a joke in itself. So, what does it tell you that the GDP PPP of a country is big? It tells you that it has the capacity to invest in large infrastructure projects. It has the capacity to invest in education and technology. It has the capacity to lead the world economically and technologically. And all this is not dependent on the per capita income. If China has a 30 trillion economy, then it has the economic capacity to put up a space station, you know, in space. There is a space station now, an international space station. It's a cooperation of Russia, China, Europe, and other countries. But now China on its own has such a big economy that it could put up a space station. And the large infrastructure project, they could finance it. So the GDP PPP, if it's very big, it tells you a lot. And if India is only 1/3 of the economy of China, it tells you that although India is relatively smaller, but the way it grows now, if the GDP, the total is growing, they could develop large infrastructure projects for the world. Now, if you look at the per capita income, you don't understand the world because the richest country, the 10 richest countries, are Luxembourg with $146,000 per person per year. That is what a person earns on average. Obviously, you have super rich people and super poor people, but Luxembourg, Ireland, Singapore, Norway, Qatar, Bermuda in the Caribbean, Switzerland, United Arab Emirates, Cayman Islands, and Denmark. These are the 10 richest countries of the world. The United States is on the 11th place with $76,000 dollars per year per capita. But what role does Luxembourg play in the world economy? None, you know. So the GDP is good to know, that it tells you something about the level of wealth per person. Luxembourg is obviously a wealthy country, even if the income is distributed unequally. But it gives you a sense of the welfare, but it doesn't tell you about the strength of a country economically. If you look at the per capita income of the BRICS country, India has a per capita income of $8,400 per year. A person earns in India on average. In China, that is almost 3 times, 21,000. South Africa 15,000, Brazil 17,000. Russian Federation is richer, is the richest in the BRICS country for 34,000. Iran with 18,000 does reasonably well, and Bolivia with 9,000 is good, but it's not part of BRICS, but the countries I will discuss in the future. The data on Venezuela and Cuba were not in the World Bank database. And as I mentioned, the United States is the richest of this group with 76,000. So per capita income, Russia with 34,000, followed by China with 21,000, and then followed by Iran, and then Brazil, and then South Africa, and then India. If you go to the Gini coefficient, then the country where income is distributed most equally is the Republic of Slovakia and Slovenia, and the most unequal countries are Panama and Colombia. There are a lot of data not in the database of the World Bank, but this gives you an idea of the most equal and the most unequal countries in the world. If you look at the BRICS countries, you see some years we have the data, other years we don't, from 1970 to 2021. Then you'll see Brazil as the most unequal country with 60 in 1919, a coefficient ratio of 60, went down to 52 in 2021. But income is distributed better in India, although because of the growing middle class in China also. And in terms of distribution of wealth, we know of the billionaires, obviously, uh, but there's a middle class in many of these countries, including the United States, that is relatively big there. So I'll discuss the economic transformation of China in the next episode because understanding the economy of China is important for everybody who wants to understand the world economy. If you want to read more about decolonial economic theory, look in chapter 9 of my book. The PowerPoint, which I've just presented, can be downloaded at sandoviera.com. If you want to support the DTM channel, subscribe to it, share it with friends, families, and colleagues, and encourage them to subscribe. Get involved in discussion groups, and if you want to make a donation, look at sandoviera.com how to do that. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.